You want to know what I'm thinking about?
Not particularly, but I have nothing better to do.
Isn't it odd how America went from the chill, utopic vibes of the 1960s to the crime and scandal-filled 80s?
What about the 1960s was chill? Between the assassination of the Kennedys, Charles Manson, and the start of Vietnam, I'd say there's a lot left to be desired about that time period. Plus, the 1980s introduced hip-hop and other modern music styles.
The 80s began with the death of John Lennon. There was an AIDS epidemic, and there was a war on drugs began, and...
Look,
What's that?
I don't know. I'll check it out.
Oh, I'm gonna regret this. Where are you?
I'm not sure, but it seems pretty cool to me.
Wait a minute. I think this is the 60s. This is awesome.
That's not where I am. The music, the fashions, that random Reagan poster over there. I think I'm in the 1980s.
Do you think we should do the logical thing and try to find a way back home?
Nah, that'd be way too boring for our audience.
Wait, what audience?
Oh, never mind. Well, why don't we just learn more about our respective time periods?
Sure. Wait, why do our phones work?
Not relevant to the plot. Now let's cut back to the title.
Whoa! Where am I? What year is it?
It's 1969 in Washington, D.C. Where'd you come from?
I'm from 2069, 100 years in the future.
How'd you get here?
Through time travel. I also visited 1989. It's pretty cool.
Hey, what are you holding?
It's a Rubik's Cube. I picked it up in 1989. You rotate the sides and try to get the same colors together. It's fun. It also had a significant impact on American culture. Everyone had one, and it was part of a huge movement. And it came to represent both genius and confusion. There was even an art form called Rubik's Cubism that was based off of the toy.
Whoa, cool. You really are from the future. What other cool games and things did they have when you visited the 1980s?
Well, they have video games, which became pretty popular throughout the decade. My favorite one was called Pac-Man. During that time, they had so many game machines and arcades where you could go with your friends to play. Arcades had a major impact on American society because they allowed people to bond over their common interest.
Wow, I wish I had video games. I mostly just play with my Barbies and Easy Bake Oven, but I also love to skateboard around my neighborhood. The skateboard culture is really big these days because many teens are trying to rebel from their parents' traditional 50s ideas. Do they still skateboard in the 1980s?
Of course, but my favorite thing to do was watch TV. My favorite television shows were The Simpsons, Baywatch, and Doctor Who, which helped to shape the modern television of my time. What's TV like in the 1960s?
Well, they just came out with color TV. When I first saw it in the television shop, I was in awe. I'd never seen anything like it. Color television has revolutionized the way Americans watch shows. It represents the many technological advances of our era. My favorite show is The Brady Bunch, but I don't watch much TV besides that show. I also like to read a lot. Right now, I'm reading The Feminine Mystique by Betty Friedan. It's so inspiring. It really represents the rebel attitudes of my era.
That's super interesting. What other things do you do for fun?
Well, many people enjoy going to music festivals such as Woodstock. In fact, the first Woodstock Festival was held in August of this year. Woodstock brought people together and promoted peace during the Vietnam War. Unfortunately, Woodstock also contributed to the increase in the use of LSD and similar drugs.
There were other popular forms of entertainment like that in the 1970s, too. For example, Queen was a popular band, and rock music was at its peak.
Wow, I didn't even think any of that could ever happen. I guess I'm looking forward to seeing the future. Well, I gotta get going. My friends and I are going roller skating later.
Yeah, and I have to get back home, too. Bye!
Goodbye.
Whoa, look outside. Are we in the 1980s?
Yep, and by the looks of it, something important is going on right now.
Dude, what kind of march is this?
I don't know. Look what's on TV.
Dying of AIDS pushed themselves in wheelchairs to the wide expanse of the mall for the huge demonstration. The civil rights issue was overtaken at the rally by the AIDS crisis striking the gay community. At dawn today, a quilt made by Americans across the country was unfurled. Each of the 2,000 panels bears the name of an AIDS victim. The silence spoke volumes about what brought the protesters here today.
That's so cool. Here comes another group of marchers.
They're chanting too.
We must end.
Oh my gosh, is that Jesse Jackson? He must be giving a speech.
AIDS virus, the AIDS crisis, and stop death and give life a chance.
He's such a powerful speaker.
I heard that because of this march, National Coming Out Day was established. And the first one will take place a year from today, October 11th.
That makes sense, considering that there are approximately 200,000 people here.
This is actually the second National March on Washington for lesbian and gay rights. The first one took place just under 8 years ago.
Oh yay, the time machine is working again.
Oh no, I think it's going backwards.
Whoa, where are we now?
Is this the 1960s?
Yeah, there's Martin Luther King Jr. giving his famous I Have a Dream speech.
Wow, it must be 1963.
I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal.
Wow, that speech was an important part of the civil rights movement that helped achieve equal rights for African Americans.
Of course, this march was extremely influential. About 200,000 people attended.
After the rally, leaders of the movement such as MLK met directly with President Kennedy.
Yeah, and they had entertainment from many famous artists, such as Ossie Davis and Bob Dylan.
The march was so influential that there is an inscription of King's famous speech on the Lincoln Monument where he delivered it.
Wait a second, that reminds me. Wasn't MLK assassinated? We need to save him.
No! Don't you know that's the most important rule of time travel? You can't alter the future. It'll throw everything off.
But we need to save him. The civil rights movement is at risk.
But don't you see? Progress will always find a way when people are being oppressed. No matter who is voicing their opinion, leaders will ensure that people gain freedom. This influence is similar to the gay rights movement in the 80s.
Wow, I guess you're right. Let's go home.
Pop culture has always been very important and has impacted the lives of so many citizens in the U.S. The 1960s and the 1980s were all about individualism. The hippie trend dominated the 60s, and the rise of pop music and brightly colored clothing were major trends in the 80s.
Pop art was most influential during the 60s, including pieces that are still very famous today, such as Marilyn Diptych and Soup Can by Andy Warhol, Drowning Girl and Wham by Roy Lichtenstein.
These types of paintings have impacted the history of art and defied art standards. They were not traditional and changed the perceptions about art to the general public.
In the 80s, styles like Neo-Impressionism and street art arose.
Artists like Keith Haring emerged and his pop art spread around the country.
A lot of famous and influential books came out during the 60s and 80s. Books such as To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee,
I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings by Maya Angelou,
A Wrinkle in Time by Madeleine Engel,
and The Autobiography of Malcolm X. Books like The Autobiography of Malcolm X and To Kill a Mockingbird were important to the civil rights movement at the time.
In the 80s, books including The Color Purple by Alice Walker,
A Light in the Attic by Shel Silverstein,
Ender's Game by Orson Scott Card,
and The BFG by Roald Dahl.
Books in the 60s were more about issues in society than how people overcame them.
While books in the 80s were more about fantasies and unrealistic ideals.
Movies were another major part of culture in both the 60s and the 80s.
Mary Poppins and The Sound of Music, starring Julie Andrews.
Psycho, featuring Anthony Perkins and Janet Leigh.
West Side Story, featuring Natalie Wood and George Chakiris.
The Graduate, starring Benjamin Braddock, and The Breakfast at Tiffany's, featuring Audrey Hepburn, were some of the many movies to emerge during the 1960s. Movies in the 60s explored many different topics. Musicals were popular, but there were some darker movies that explored more heavy topics as well. On the other hand, movies in the 80s were films such as The Princess Bride, featuring Carrie Eels and Robin Wright.
The Breakfast Club, starring Molly Ringwald.
Top Gun, starring Tom Cruise.
E.T., Ferris Bueller's Day Off, starring Matthew Broderick.
The Shining, featuring Jack Nicholson and Shelley Duvall. And The Terminator, starring Aaron Schwarzenegger, were some of the many films that were released in the 1980s.
Don't forget about the infamous Star Wars movies.
Yes, of course. Although these movies had different storylines, one big theme in the 1980s was heroism and fantasy.
Cartoons were also an important part of culture in the 60s and the 80s. Cartoons that we know and love today, such as the Flintstones, which aired from 1960 to 1965.
And Popeye the Sailor, which aired from 1960 to 1962.
And The Jetsons, which aired from 1962 to 1963, and then aired again during the 80s.
Leading into the 80s, shows like Gummy Bears and Fraggle Rock aired.
DuckTales and Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles.
Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, heroes in a half shell, turtle power.
Cartoons in the 60s were more about American empowerment and strength, which was a response to the Vietnam War. There was more peace in the 80s and people felt safer, so more cartoons were about fantasies and had personification of animals.
Pop culture between the 1960s and the 1980s changed drastically. Art, books, and movies of the 60s had a very different vibe than those of the 80s.
The 1960s was a time of music celebration. Through music, many artists were able to speak their minds and protest the government and the war. Artists such as Jimi Hendrix, The Doors, and Janis Joplin helped lead the peace movement and performed at the most legendary music festival of this generation, Woodstock 1969. A strong desire to be as different as possible from their parents led the young people of the 60s to do a lot of hallucinogenic drugs, infusing their music with a trippy and incoherent vibe. They also wanted to resist established powers, mainly the government and corporations. However, despite popular music's tone of resistance, there was a general message of hope and happiness in most popular songs.
The 1960s also introduced the most popular music group of all time, the Beatles.
1, 2, 3, 4. Well, she was just 17. You know what I mean.
Ringo Starr, George Harrison, John Lennon, and Paul McCartney formed their group in Liverpool in 1960. Their boyish charm, combined with their catchy lyrics and strong songwriting skills, brought them international fame. The Beatles were new, revolutionary, and nothing like the music adults of the 1950s had listened to. At concerts, the fans often went totally crazy, rushing the stage and having to be subdued by police. They were first introduced to American audiences on The Ed Sullivan Show in 1964. Known for both their extensive use of LSD and their timeless melodies, they have been described as some of the most influential and talented artists ever.
During the 70s, rock remained prevalent, but a new genre was gaining massive popularity: disco. Disco is a unique combination of salsa, Motown, funk, and many other assorted genres. It was played primarily in dance clubs. It also ushered in an entirely new era of dance, and its influences remain extremely prevalent today. The 1970s also introduced classic rock, which also followed through into the 1980s with artists such as Queen, Led Zeppelin, and David Bowie.
The 80s came and changed the face of music. Along with a new decade, a new form of music was ushered in. Artists such as Madonna, Michael Jackson, and Cyndi Lauper. Fast-paced synth mixed with classic rock created what is now referred to as pop. Themes in these songs changed from revolution to love and heartbreak.
During the 80s, another new genre was born. From Motown and R&B came a totally new and revolutionary sound known as hip-hop. Early hip-hop artists included the Sugar Hill Gang, Run DMC, NWA, and Public Enemy. The beat-heavy songs mixed with simple rhyme tackled societal problems, particularly pertaining to status and race.
The music of the 1960s was a representation of a counterculture finally free from the conformity of the 50s. However, by the 80s, genuine messages of hope and revolution had given way to synth-heavy dance music about love and sex. The 80s dance pop could not have existed without the classic rock birthed from the revolutionary 60s. Without question, the 60s, 70s, and 80s had some of the biggest impacts on music in recorded history.
The longest war also became its most controversial.
I see a red door and I want it painted black. No colors anymore, I want them to turn black. I see the girls go by dressed in their summer clothes.
The war saw over 1.3 million total deaths and over 50,000 American deaths. The war on violence and the savagery of it would go on to leave lasting impacts in the American public's mind and the nation's perception of war in all mediums.
The unyielding years of violence staying in the public's eye left the country with an idea of horror and violence to America's involvement in the war. Many films from the late 70s and into the 80s saw the darkest of humanity and the experience of the war being depicted in such films as Forrest Gump, Platoon, Apocalypse Now, and many others. The generation that grew up in the late 60s and throughout the 70s had a much different perspective on the world after growing up in the Vietnam era. The hope and joy of the 60s was crushed by the devastation and violence, so that the mood of the 70s was filled with melancholy.
This exploration of cultural intrigue into the violence that defined post-World War II America would lead into a much different modern image of war. Vietnam washed away the image of the clean-cut Allied soldier fighting for freedom and democracy of the Second World War. And despite the official stance of the US government being the protection of democracy, same as World War II, the image of the common Vietnam soldier became much less uniform from demographic to demographic.
American soldiers weren't viewed as the protectors of the free world, but rather baby killers, fighting the rich man's war. This left many roots for the anti-war and anti-military movements, the sentiments that would arise in future wars, such as the war on terror in Iraq and Afghanistan. Soldiers were no longer such idols of the American public, but were seen as images of model upstanding, but were the dirty vehicles through which corrupt politicians carried out their personal agendas. On the home front, the war had extremely polarizing effects. It broke the nation into many of the political and social sects seen today. The many protests, and mainly coming from our newer, younger generation of college students, led into the era of political dividing.
The protests against Vietnam rose along with many other social controversies. Often muddled with protests for civil rights and the sexual revolution, those against the war included civil rights leaders such as MLK and Muhammad Ali. The opposition to the war also resulted in 206,000 people refusing to be drafted to Vietnam.
The Vietnam War, despite a declaration of war never actually being signed by Congress, defined modern America. It spanned over the course of the burgeoning new post-World War II America to the period of the radical domestic upheaval and change of the 60s and into the midst of the political and social distrust and formation of the modern era in the 70s.
Welcome to Fab Fashion, where we discuss the latest trends and new coming styles of the 60s.
Hey,
Who are you?
I'm Jancy from the future.
What? How is that even possible?
Well, you see, I traveled in a time machine and traveled back in time from the 80s to the 60s.
Whoa, that's so fab. What's it like?
Well, it's full of great music, entertainment, and fashion. That is way more bomb diggity than those ugly clothes.
Excuse me? The styles of the 60s is filled with the most psychedelic things like tie-dye and round sunglasses and the coolest fashion icons.
You're bugging. We have singers like Michael Jackson, Madonna, and Boy George. All of them are singers who are idolized by the public because of their hit albums and signature looks.
Who are those people?
Michael Jackson will become the king of pop, obviously. How do you not know that?
Maybe because you're from the future.
Oh yeah, but anyways, he's been making hit songs since he was little. He eventually created a whole new style of pop. He will popularize the leather jacket, shoulder pads, and gloves. Many of his performance outfits are going to inspire looks all across America. And don't even get me started on Madonna. Every girl will look up to her. Her bold makeup and hair, grungy style, and big earrings. She will also revolutionize pop and become a highly influential person.
Madonna? What type of name is that? And what about Boy George? Who is he?
Boy George is really going to shape the fashion scene. He will be the androgynous lead singer of a hit band and inspire cross-dressing throughout teens and young adults. They'll start wearing big hats, bold hairstyles, and cat eyeliner.
Cross-dressing?
It's when people wear clothing typical to the opposite gender.
All of those people sound weird. I'm definitely not excited for the 80s. Our fashion icons are way more awesome. We have the Beatles and Jane Birkin.
Yeah, I know all of them, and they're so dated. What's so cool about them?
What? The Beatles are the newest, most sensational artists and style icons out right now. They make looks like colored round sunglasses, patterned suits, and long hair popular and cool.
All of that hippie stuff is cool, I guess.
And did I mention Jane Birkin? She's a famous actress who inspired new looks among girls. She pioneered the trend of long hair and bangs, turtlenecks, leather belts, and girls wearing jeans.
We make jeans much cooler in the 80s. We get all sorts of jeans, like high-waisted jeans, acid jeans, and cuff jeans.
It doesn't seem like future fashions have as much purpose as ours does. We have a purpose that's not just to look cool or fit in. Our clothes are anti-fashion statements that challenge the government and social norms.
That's cool, I guess, but look out. 80s fashion reflects the political environment of America and also reflects the impact of a new digital age.
Digital age? What's that?
You'll see.
Whoa! How did we get back?
With some low-budget special effects, I imagine.
What?
What? Anyway, I feel like we should talk about what we learned.
I don't really want to talk about that.
Well, I learned that the 1980s were pretty awesome, but they also had a lot of problems. For example,
This seems really scripted.
Anyway, the overarching lesson of our experience is that the 1960s weren't perfect, and the 1980s weren't perfect.
So, can we just meet into the compromise in the 1970s?
Let's just cut to the closing credits.